Chapter 5. Then there came an afternoon in the autumn, 3 months after Midsummer Night. Ingunn went through the gate from which the stakes were now removed, as the cattle had been brought in from the sæter and were grazing freely over all the home fields. Today the cows were in the meadow below the cornfield. No fairer sight could be seen than these fat sæter-fed beasts glistening in the sun. They were of every hue that cattle can be, and the aftergrass was so green and thick that it seemed in a ferment of plenty, with masses of shimmering dog-fennel among the grass. The sky was blue, and blithe little fine-weather clouds drifted high up. The fjord was blue, and reflected the autumnal brightness of the land, the red and yellow woods surrounding the home fields. Farther off stood the dark blue forests, where each single fir tree stood out by itself, as they stood drinking in light in the strong, cool air. The glad radiance of the day forced her to shrink beneath her own desperate dread and misery. She dared not fail when he had trysted her. She was in mortal fear of being alone with him, but she dared do nothing else. For if she did not come, he might seek her out up at the homestead, and then others would hear. The stubble shone like pale gold on either side of the path. Now there was a wide view over the open reaped fields. His little dun jade was grazing in the coppice by the burn. Ingunn prayed in her heart, a wordless prayer that was but a groan of her deep distress, as she had prayed that night when he stood outside her door, knocked softly, and called her by name. In the darkness she had knelt at the head of the bed, clasping the carved horse's head of the bedpost, and called for help, soundlessly within herself, shaking with terror. For if the disaster had happened, if she had sunk into the worst that could befall, she would not sink yet deeper. But it came over her that he could force her against her will, so that she must cross the floor and let him in. When she guessed that he had gone from her door, she had sobbed from very gratitude, for it seemed that it was not her own tiny spark of will that had held her back, but an invisible power, strong and stern, had filled the darkness between her and the terror at the door. As she huddled exhausted beneath the bedclothes, humbly thankful for her deliverance, she had thought that no punishment for her sin could be so hard that she would not accept it with gratitude, if only she might never more fall into Teet's power. And when they had met next day, and he jested at her sleeping so heavily that he had to go unsolaced from her door, she had answered, "I was awake. I heard you." She was quite calm, for she was sure that the good powers that had kept her back last night would not suffer him to compel her any more. When he had asked why she had not opened, whether she had not dared or someone else had been within, she made bold to answer, "No, I would not. And you must not come here any more, Teet. Be good. Do not come after me any more." "Oh, I have never heard the like. Be good, you say? But the other night—" "The other night?" "Yes, yes." She had interrupted him with a groan of suffering. "'Tis ill enough, sin enough." "Sin?" he exclaimed, overwhelmed with astonishment. "Is it that you think of?" She had remembered it then, and she remembered it now, as she walked here, and she felt a sort of pity for the lad. He could not know how great a sin had been committed when she let herself be his, that she had broken a troth of which she could not even bear to think in this outpost of hell where now she had her dwelling. 6 weeks. 6 weeks it was already since that day and that night, which she had begun to hope, deep down below her conscious thoughts, might be forgotten. Some day. She could do penance and be shriven, and then she could let herself forget this matter of Tiet. For she had neither seen nor heard anything of him since, until today, when he came to Berg. He had found himself an errand to Lady Mannhild, and he had made this tryst with her, and she dared do nothing but go. Now she could see the man. He was sitting on a rock within the thicket. And silently she cried within her, "Help me! Help me! Let him not frighten me, so that I do his will again." Where he sat was almost the same spot on which they had stood together in the dark on Midsummer Night, when he had repeated the verse about the willow for her. But she did not think of that. It was now a light and airy bower under the fading trees. Sunshine and blue sky reached them through the half-stripped branches. A glitter of light danced on the burn behind the bushes. Dewdrops glistened on pale blades of grass and on the coarse weeds that were already touched and browned by the frost. The patch was bright with fallen leaves. Even the moss-grown rock on which he had been sitting was so fair to see, with the wealth of green cushions clinging to it, that she was in sheer despair at being so alone with her terror and hopelessness in this fair and glorious world. "Christ save me! What has come to you?" He had leapt up and stood looking at her. Then he made as though he would clasp her to him. She raised her hands with a little blunted gesture, weakly warding him off as she shrank away. Quickly he set her down on the rock and stood looking at her. "You don't seem to have been right merry all these weeks that I haven't seen you. Has anyone got wind of it?" he asked quickly. Ingunn shook her head. She trembled as she sat. "It is best I tell you my good news at once," he said, smiling a little at her. "I have been at Hamar, Ingunn, and spoken with Master Torgard about the matter. He has promised that he himself will speak for me with your kinsman, he and Gunnar Bergson. So I am not so badly off for spokesman to my suit. What do you say to that?" She felt as if she had once been carried away by a landslide, and had crawled out, bruised and bleeding, and now this fresh fall came and buried her. "I have never thought any such thing," she whispered, wringing her hands, "that you could ask for me." "I have thought of it before, I have, last summer sometimes. I liked you from the first time I saw you, and as you made no secret of your liking for me. But it is not certain," he looked down at her with a crafty laugh, "that I should have bestirred myself so speedily had you not barred your door to me even the second night. I saw myself afterwards that it would have been too perilous had we carried on with that game at Berg. And I am loath to lose you. So now you may cease to mourn for your sin, if it is that that has troubled you." He smiled and stroked her cheek. Ingunn cowered away like a dog that expects to be whipped. I had scarce thought you would take that so sadly. But perhaps you can take comfort now, my poor one." "Tiet, it is impossible we two can come together." "Neither Gunnar nor Master Torgard seem to think so." "What is it you have told them?" she whispered almost inaudibly. "I have told them all there has been between us, except that thing you are thinking of." He laughed. "But I have told them that we two have gotten such a heartfelt kindness for each other. And now at last you had let me know for certain that you would be glad we should be wed. But you must know I have said nothing that may let them guess I have had more of you than your word." He gave a wanton laugh, took her by the chin, and tried to make her look up. "My Ingunn?" "I have never meant that." "How so?" Teet's face darkened. "Do you mean, perchance, I am too poor a match for you? Gunnar and Master Torgard did not think that either. You must know I have no thought of staying in Gunnar's service after I am married. We are agreed that I shall leave him after Yule. 'Tis not my purpose to stay longer in this part of the country, unless you wish it, and your kinsfolk will give us land to live on, but haply they won't do that. Master Torgard will give me letters to the Archbishop himself, Ingunn, and to certain friends of his in the chapter there, and he will write in them that I am a most skilful clerk and painter of images on vellum. I can support you much better by my handicraft when I come to such a place as Nidaros than any of you country folk think. There I might find many roads to wealth, Ingunn, when I get goods that I can trade in. And then we can sail home to Iceland. You spoke of that many a time in the summer, and said that you would like to come to Iceland. I think I can promise you that I shall be able to take you thither, and that right handsomely." He looked down at her white, terror-stricken face, and it made him angry. "You ought to think of it, Ingunn. You are not so young either. You have entered on the 2 score of years. And your suitors have not worn down the grass of your kinsman's courts lately, I have heard." He looked away, a little ashamed of his own words. "Teet, I cannot." She twisted her hands violently in her lap. "There is another to whom I have given my troth long years ago." "I marvel whether he would think you have kept it well, if he knew everything," said Teet dryly. "'Tis not that I would be content with such a troth if it were my betrothed that gambled with a strange man, and jested with him so freely, as you have shown me that you liked the game we two have played last summer. No, the troll take me, if I would, not even if you had kept back that which you parted with the first day we chanced to be alone in the house." Ingunn put her hand to her face, as though he had struck her. "Teet, it was against my will." "I know that." He gave a sneering laugh. "I did not believe, I could not think you would do such a thing." "How would you not?" "You were so young. You are younger than I am. I thought it was but wanton frolic, for you were so young a boy. I resisted, and tried to defend myself." Teet gave a little laugh. "Yes, that is the way with most of you. But I am not so young, but I have learnt this, that nothing makes you women so angry and so scornful of a young and innocent lad as when he lets himself be checked by such resistance." Ingunn stared at him, stiff with horror. "Had you been a pure young maid—" "I have never shamed a young maid. I am not like that. But you can't ask me to believe you did not know full well how the dance would end that you led me the whole summer long." Ingunn continued to stare. Slowly a blush crept over her grey face. "I may tell you," said Teet coolly. "So much have I heard of you that I know of that man who served in your father's home, with whom you had a bastard when you were but 14. "He was no serving man, and never have I had a child." Then she bowed low, with her arms clasping her knees and her head hidden in them. She began to weep very softly. Teet smiled doubtfully as he stood looking down at the weeping girl. I don't know if it is him you are waiting for to come back and marry you, or if you have had others since. However that may be, he does not seem to kill himself with haste, this friend of yours. I greatly fear, Ingunn, 'tis of no use for you to stay for him. For if you did that, there might easily come too many between you. She sat as before, weeping silently and in bitter pain. Teat said more gently, Better take me, Ingunn, whom you have in your hand. I shall be a good husband to you, if only you will put off this flightiness of yours and be steady and sane from today. I am fond of you, he stammered awkwardly, stroking her head lightly. In spite of everything. Ingunn shook his hand away from her head. Don't weep so, Ingunn. I have no thought of deceiving you. She raised her head and gazed fixedly before her. It would be idle, she guessed, to try to tell him the truth of what he had heard. Such must indeed be the talk hereabouts, where no one knew Olav, and few had known her as other than a worthless woman, the shame of her family, whom her kinsfolk had thrust aside in disgrace. She had not strength to speak of it either. But this new thing that had befallen her with Teat, she thought she must tell him how it had been brought about. So she broke silence. I know well that this is a punishment for my sin. I knew I sinned grievously when I would not forgive Kolbein, my father's brother. I rejoiced when he was dead, and I thought of him with hatred and lust of vengeance. I refused to go with the others to his funeral feast. It was he who was the chief cause that I was parted from one to whom I was promised in childhood, and would have taken before everyone. Not one prayer would I say for Kolbein's soul, though I guessed he might need all the prayers that could be said. When they said the De Profundis at even, I went out of the room, and I refused to go north with the others to his burial. God have mercy on me. I knew well that it is sinful to hate an enemy after he has been called to judgment. Then you came, and I was glad to think of other things. I was happy. And when you would bear me company up in the weaving loft, I had no other thought but that you were a boy. And as it was with me when I was young, I had most mind to play and romp with you, for I would think no more of the dead man. And when we took to throwing the wool from the sacks at each other. But I never thought that if you were uncourtly and said lewd words. I thought it was only that you were so young and wanton. Teat stood looking down at her with the same doubtful little smile. Well, let that be so. I got you first against your will, but afterwards, at night? Ingunn dropped her head hopelessly. Of that she could say nothing. She was scarce able to unravel it to herself. She had lain awake hour after hour, crushed by dismay and shame. And nevertheless it was as though she could not bring herself to see that it was true, that now she was lost and branded with shame. For already it seemed but as the memory of a dream, or an intoxication, her own wild merriment of the afternoon in the wool loft. And that Teat had caught her. But all the time his image appeared to her as she had brought herself to see it after midsummer night, when next day she had been angry with herself for her foolish fear of him. For he was but a boy, a likeable, clever, lively boy, who had brought her nothing but pleasure. A little wanton of speech, but then he was so young. And yet she knew, as she lay there, that now she had brought disaster upon herself, even to death and perdition. And now she was an adulteress. At last she had fallen asleep, and she was awakened by Teat taking her in his arms. She had not thought to bar the door. They never did so when they slept in the loft in summer. She no longer remembered clearly why she had not tried to be rid of him. Perhaps she had thought it would make her shame yet deeper if she now said that she would have no more to do with him who had already possessed her, that she was loath to see him again and hated him. And when he himself came and she heard his bright young voice, she may have thought that after all she did not hate him so terribly. He was so simple-hearted and had no inkling of what he had brought upon her. For he knew nothing of her being bound to another, married in the sight of God. Only next morning, when she looked at her misfortune in the clear light of day, was it borne in upon her that she must escape from this at once, must not let herself be dragged yet deeper. She felt that she herself had no power to do anything. Of her own strength she could not break with him. But she had cried for help in her bitter woe. "Whatever may become of me, I shall not complain, if only I be saved from further sin." Teat stood looking at her, and as she still kept silence, he held out his hand to her. "Better not to quarrel, Ingunn. Let us try to agree and be friends." "Yes, but I will not marry you. Teat, you must tell these friends of yours they are not to bring forward your suit." "That I will not do." "And if your kinsmen say yes?" "Even then I must say no." Teat paused for a moment. She saw the rage seething in the young man. "And what if I do as you wish, cease my wooing, and come here no more? And if your kinsfolk should see for themselves in a little while that you have strayed again into your old bad ways?" "Still I would not marry you." "You must not be too sure of finding me and catching me again, if you should need me this winter. I have offered once to do rightly by you, and you met me with scorn and cruel words." "I shall not need you." "Are you so sure of that?" "Yes. Before I would send for you, I will cast myself into the fjord." "All right, then. That will be your doing, and not mine. Your sin, and not mine. So, you think we have no more to say?" Ingunn nodded in silence. Teat paused a moment, then turned on his heel, leapt across the burn, and ran after his pony. She was standing in the same place as he came riding up the path. He pulled up beside her. "Ingunn," he pleaded. She looked him straight in the face, and beside himself with rage and agitation, he leant forward and struck her with all his force below the ear, making her reel. "A wicked wretch you are! A cursed, fickle bitch!" His voice was broken by sobs. "And you have such reward as you deserve for the false game you played with me." He struck his heels into the pony's sides, and the little jade broke into a trot for a few paces. But when the hill began, it fell into its usual amble. Ingunn stood watching the rider. She held her hand to her flaming cheek, but she was no longer angry with Teat for this. With a strange and painful clarity she saw that Teat could but think her what he had called her, and it added to her sorrow. Even now she could remember that she had liked him, and she pitied him, for he was so young. She would have to go home now, she thought. But she felt she must break down at the thought of the house above. Nowhere could she turn without being reminded of this boy. And yet she could not resist the rising thought at the back of her mind. In a few months it would all be easier for her, when she was no longer forced to think of, and a sudden pang of fear came over her like a hot wave. Though there was little likelihood of that. But would to God Pete had said nothing of it. She had dreaded it enough already. Sick as she was now, with grief and anxiety, she nevertheless knew that when so much time had gone by that she might be quite sure she was safe from that, then she would not suffer so terribly. Then she would not feel as now that her whole life had been ruined by this disaster and this sin. Old Mistress Asa failed greatly during the autumn, and Ingunn tended her lovingly and untiringly. Lady Marnhild marvelled at the girl. For all these years she had seen her niece dragging herself about like a sleepwalker, doing only what she could not avoid, and that little as slowly as might be. Now it seemed that Ingunn had waked up. Her aunt saw that she could work when she chose. She was by no means so incapable when she took herself in hand. Now and again the thought occurred to Lady Marnhild. Perhaps the poor thing was afraid of what might become of her when the old lady was gone. Her unwonted diligence was a prayer to them not to look on her too ungraciously when the grandmother no longer needed her care. Perhaps they had not been friendly enough to the poor frail child. Ingunn snatched at everything she could find to occupy her. When her hands were not full with the sick old woman, she applied herself to any work she could find, anything that might help her to keep her thoughts from the one thing to which they constantly flew back, in spite of herself. She waited in breathless tension for her fear to be proved groundless. All the thoughts with which she had played for years, of life with Olav at Hestviken, of Olav coming to take her away, of their children. It was like the touch of the angel's flaming sword merely to approach the memory of these dreams. She could scarce keep herself from wailing aloud. She threw herself upon all such tasks as demanded thought and told upon the body. She would not give in if she felt sick this autumn, for she was not near so ailing as she had been the first days at Micklebow. It had always been the way with her that when she had been badly frightened, she felt giddy and had violent qualms afterwards. She had only to think of the day they drove over the rocks in the sled, she and Olav. It was Yuletide, not long before they were grown up. They had taken it into their heads that they would go to Mass in the parish church, and so they drove off in the dark winter morning, though none of the others at Fretterstein would go to church that day. A strong south wind was blowing, with rain and mild weather. She remembered so clearly the long-drawn dizzying fear that seemed to descend on her whole body and dissolve it as she felt the sled swerve and slide backwards over the smooth, ice-bound rocks. It came across the horse's quarters as he struggled to keep his feet, striking sparks and splintering the ice, but was carried away and thrown down. Olav, who had jumped off to support the sled, was flung headlong and fell on the frozen ground. And then she knew no more. But when she came to herself again, she was on her knees in the soft snowdrift, hanging over Olav's arm and retching till she thought her whole inside would be turned out. And Olav, with his free hand, was pressing lumps of snow and ice to the back of her head, which she had struck against the rock. This time, too, it was only fear that ailed her. On the 8th day of Yule she sat alone with her grandmother. The others had gone to a feast. She had laid plenty of fuel on the hearth, for her feet were so cold. The flickering gleam of the fire lent a semblance of life to the sleeping face of the old woman in the bed, dead white and wrinkled as it was. By the pale light of winter days, Ingunn had often thought it already as peaceful as the face of a corpse. "Grandmother, do not die," she wailed below her breath. Her grandmother and she had been companions so long that they had drifted into a backwater of their own, while the life of other folk ran past outside. And she had come to love her grandmother in the end, unspeakably, she thought. It was as though she herself had found support, her only support, in the old woman, as she led her faltering steps, dressed her and fed her. And now it would soon be all over. If only she could have laid herself down beside the aged woman. Sometimes she had dared to hope that this would be the end, that she would be permitted to die here in her dim corner, screened by her grandmother's protection, before anyone had guessed. But now her grandmother would soon be dead. And then she would have to go out among the others, and she would be haunted by the terror that one day someone would see it in her. But it was not certain. It was not certain even yet. It was only the fear of it that drove and forced the blood in her body. She had felt such violent shocks in her heart as almost to make her swoon. At times there was a sudden throbbing in the veins of her throat, and her pulses seemed to race through her head behind the ears. And that feeling she had had yester-even, and in the night, and today again, time after time, deep in her right side, like a sudden blow or thrust. Hopefully it was but the blood hammering in a vein. For even if there had been anything, it was not possible it had quickened, the way she had starved and laced herself tight. The weeks went by, and more than once Lady Marnhild said to Ingunn that she must spare herself somewhat. The unwanted hard work must be too much for her in the end. Ingunn made but little reply, and continued to tend her grandmother. But the active fit seemed to have left her again. She had slipped back into herself, as it were. She felt as though the soul within her had sunk to the bottom of a thick darkness, in which it fought a blind struggle with the sinister foreign being that she housed. Day and night it lay tossing, and would have room for itself and burst her aching body. At times she felt she could bear no more. She was in such pain all over that she could scarcely see. For not even at night did she dare to relax the bandages that caused her such intolerable torment. But she could not give up. She must get it to stop, to move no more. There was one memory which constantly floated before her at this time. Once, when she and her sister were children, Tora's cat had caught a bird which Olav had brought her, that she might tame it. The cat had just kittened, and so she stole 2 of its young, ran down to the pond, and held them under water. She had expected them to die as soon as they went under. But it was incredible how long the little beasts kept on wriggling in her hands, and struggled for their lives, while little air bubbles came up all the time. At last she thought they were dead. But no, there was another jerk. Then she took them out, ran back with them, and laid them down by their mother. But by that time they were indeed lifeless. She never thought of it as her child, this alien life which she felt growing in her and stirring ever stronger, in spite of all her efforts to strangle it. It was as though some deformed thing, wild and evil, had penetrated within her and sucked its fill of her blood and her marrow, a horror she must hide. What it would look like when once it came out into the light, and what would happen to herself if anyone found out she had borne such a thing, Of this she dared not even think. At last, 6 weeks after Yule, Asa Magnusdatter died, and her children Ivar and Manhild made a great funeral feast for her. The last 7 days and nights of her grandmother's life, Ingunn had slept only in snatches, lying down in her clothes. And when the corpse was borne out, all she asked was to be allowed to rest. She crept into her bed. Now she slept, and now she lay staring before her, with no power to think of the future by which she was faced. But when the feast came, she had to get up and busy herself among the guests. No one wondered at her looking like a ghost of herself in her dark blue morning gown, wrapped in her long black veil. Her face was grey and yellow, her skin lay stretched and shiny over the bones. Her eyes were wide and dark and tired, and the men and women, her kinsfolk, came up and said kind words of praise to her, almost all of them. Lady Manhild had spoken of her faithfulness to the dead woman during all these years. Both Master Torgard, the cantor, and the Sheriff of Rain were among the funeral guests, and at once it flashed upon Ingunn. Teat! She had almost forgotten him. It was as though she could not make out the connection between him and her misfortune. Even now, when she called him to mind, it was only as an acquaintance she had liked at one time, but then some ugly thing had befallen them, so that she scarce cared to think of him again. But now the thought came to her. What had he said to his spokesman when he withdrew his suit? If he had exposed her to them, then she would indeed be lost. She must try to find out whether they knew anything. She felt like a worn-out poor man's jade that had toiled in harness under a grievous load till she was almost broken-winded, and now was to bear yet more. "You have not brought your clerk with you?" she asked Gunnar of Rhine as indifferently as she could. "Is it that Teat you mean?" "Ha! He has run away from me." "So, now you ask for him. They tell me he had errands hither to Berg early and late. Is it true it was you he was after?" Ingunn tried to laugh. "Not that I know. He said he would send suitors to ask for me, and that you were to be one of them. I counselled him against it, but can it be true?" The sheriff's eyes twinkled. "Yes, he did say something of the same to me, and he had the same counsel from me as from you." Gunnar laughed till his stomach shook. "What became of him when he ran away from Rhine?" asked Ingunn, and she too laughed a little. "Do you know that, Gunnar?" "We will ask the cantor. It was to him he was going." "Hey, Master Torgard, will you come here, please? Tell me, good sir, do you know what became of that Icelander, my writer? Mistress Ingunn here is asking after him. You must know he intended her such honour that he would sue for the hand of Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter." "No, do you say so?" said the priest. "He had many strange devices, my good Teat. So, then you are left to mourn his absence, my child." "I can do nothing else. For he was such a marvellous cunning man, I have heard, that you, master, would send him to the archbishop himself, since there was none other in this land who could make use of such skill. This must be true, I think, for he said so himself." "Yes, he could make up a tale. Half crazed he was, forsooth, though the boy could write better than most. He came in to see me a while ago, but, by my troth, I'll not have him in my household again. He is a good clerk, but a madcap. So it will profit you nothing to weep for him, my little Ingunn. But is it true? Was the boy so bold that he dared speak of seeking a wife at Berg?" "No." The priest shook his little bird-like old head. So she guessed it could not be altogether true, what he had said to her that last day they spoke together. But now she had added this to her other anxieties. Had she done a madly foolish thing in letting these men see that she thought enough of Teat to care to ask after him? When the guests departed after the funeral, Tora stayed behind with her 2 eldest children and old Ivar Torresson of Galterstadt. One evening when they were sitting together, they had brought out the treasures they had inherited from Lady Asa and were looking at them. Tora said once more that her sister ought to take up her abode with her. Lady Marnhild said that Ingunn must do as she would. "If you would rather go to Fretterstein, Ivar and I will not hinder you." "I would rather stay here at Berg," replied Ingunn in a low voice. "If you will still grant me lodging here now that grandmother is gone." Tora renewed her demand. She herself had now 5 children, and she had charged herself with the fostering of the motherless twins left by Hakon's sister, so she needed Ingunn's help. Lady Marnhild saw a look of perfect misery in Ingunn's thin and wasted face, and she held out her hand to her. "Come hither to me, Ingunn. Shelter and food and clothing you shall have with me as long as I live, or till Olaf comes and takes you home. For I believe full surely that he will come one day, if God be willing and he is alive. Do you think," she said scornfully to Tora, "that Hakon will show his sister-in-law such honour at Fretterstein as Steinfinn's daughter has the right to look for? Perhaps she is to dwell in her father's home and be nurse to his and Helga Gautsdatter offspring. That Ivar and I will not consent to. I had thought I would give you this." She took up the great gold ring which she had inherited from her mother, "as a memorial of the faithful care with which you tended our mother all these years." She took hold of Ingunn's hand and was about to put the ring on it. "But what have you done with your betrothal ring? Have you taken it off? Poor thing, I believe you have worked so hard that your hands are quite swollen." Ingunn felt that Tora gave a little start. She dared not look at her sister, yet she did so for an instant. Tora's face was unmoved, but there was an uneasy flicker in her eyes. Ingunn herself could not feel the floor under her feet. She clung fast to one thought. "If I fall into a swoon now, they will know everything." But she seemed to be listening to another's words as she thanked her aunt for the costly gift, and when she was back in her usual place she did not know how she had come there. Late in the evening she stood by the courtyard gate, calling and whistling for one of the dogs. Then Tora came across to her. There was no moon, and the black sky sparkled with stars. The 2 women drew their hooded cloaks tightly about them as they tramped in the loose snow and talked of the wolves, whose inroads had been very bold in the last few weeks. Now and again Ingunn whistled and called in an anxious voice, "Tota! Tota! Tota!" It was so dark that they could not see each other's faces. Tora asked in a low and strangely dejected tone, "Ingunn, you are not sick, are you?" "I cannot say I am well," answered Ingunn quite calmly and easily. "Thin and light as Asa had grown at last, I can tell you it was a trying task to lift her and move her day in, day out, for months, and there was little rest at night. But now it will soon be better with me." "You do not think it is anything else that ails you, sister?" asked Tora as before. "No, I don't think that." "Last summer you were so red and white, and as slender as when we were both young," whispered Tora. Ingunn managed to answer with a melancholy little laugh. "Some time I must begin to show, I think, that I am on the way to 30. Look at the great children you have, my Tora. Do you remember that I am a year and a half older than you?" In the darkness between the fences, a black ball came rushing along. The dog jumped up at Ingunn, nearly sending her headlong into the snowdrifts, and licked her face. She caught it by the muzzle and forepaws, keeping it off as she laughed and spoke to it fondly. "Ah, and well it was the wolf did not get you tonight either, Tota, my Tota." The sisters wished each other good night and separated. But Ingunn lay sleepless in the dark, trying to bear this new anxiety. The Tora must have a suspicion. And the temptation came to her. What if she told Tora of her distress and begged for help? Or Lady Marnhild? She thought of the lady's marked kindness that evening, and felt tempted to be weak and give herself up. Dala. It had also flashed across her mind when she thought she could no longer bear this secret torment alone. Perhaps if she turned to Dala. In breathless suspense she kept her eyes on her sister during the days Tora stayed on at Berg. But she could notice nothing. Neither by look nor by word did Tora betray any sign that she guessed how it was with her elder sister. Then she went away, and Ingunn was left alone with her aunt and the old housefolk. She counted the weeks. 30 were gone already. There were but 10 left. She must hold out so long. 9 weeks. 8 weeks. But as yet she had never clearly acknowledged to herself what the purpose was to which she clung, as she struggled on and suffered, as though stifled in a darkness full of formless terrors, with a dull pain over her whole body and a single thought in her head, that no one must have any inkling of the misfortune that had befallen her. The end that she saw before her, when she thought of it, she was filled with a horror that was like the stiffness of death. But it appeared to her that it was the end of the road, and she must reach it, though she would try to walk the last piece with closed eyes. Even when she sought a kind of easement by playing with the thought of crying for help, speaking to someone before it was too late, she had never thought in earnest that she would do so. She must go on to what she saw before her. So far on in the spring, the ground was almost always free of snow hereabouts. They would not find her footprints. The great birchwood north of the manor stretched from the rocks where they smoked fish almost down to the lake. At its lower end it narrowed to a strip between crags, where folk hardly ever came, and where they could not be seen or heard from the house. The ice did not leave the bay so early, but on the southern shore and on the screes below the birchwood lay great heaps of stones that had been cleared off the fields in former times. There the people of Berg were used to throw down carcasses of horses and other beasts that had died a natural death.